island. I think I first came to the digging in the islands in '89, but I was preceded by Helen, who excavated with John Barber and Hornish Point in
1982.
1982, when we were all very, very young. She was a child genius. She was very small. Anyway, so this is mostly about Cladh Hallan, and that's because I've just finished basically writing the report. So this is sort of like hot off the press, and nobody else has seen this yet. But we'll also kind of touch on some other bits and pieces. And so basically, I'm an animal archaeologist, Helen is mostly a plant archaeologist, and Sally is mostly basically maritime marine archaeologist. But she was my PhD student and studied the cetacean from the sites here. So she looked at all the whales and the dolphins that we recovered. We've previously given you a talk on that, so hopefully you'll remember some of that. Keep that in mind, because I'm not going to go backwards tonight. So I think one of the things we can think about is islands shape human culture and humans in turn shape islands. So this is a story both of kind of about what the island does to the people who arrive here, and also what the people who arrive here do to the islands, because it's this kind of symbiotic relationship that's always changing through time. So obviously you probably all know that we've been here for many years and we've dug on many sites, so this is just kind of spots on some of the sites that we might think you might know about. So there's a range of sites that basically run from possibly the Mesolithic. There's not great evidence, and it's quite hard to find the results out about that. But there's distinct Neolithic settlements at Northton, but they don't have very large bone assemblages. So when I'm thinking about animals, quite often I'm desperately looking around for some bits of bone that's going to tell me something about the animals that were here in the Neolithic. So we know a few things about the Neolithic, but the assemblages are not very big, unfortunately. There's Neolithic at Northton, at Mulville, and then as you go through time, you go into the Bronze Age, and Cladh Hallan is this fantastic Bronze Age site, which has got this enormous amount of evidence. And then we kind of stroll through sort of the Iron Age into sort of the late Iron Age, then the Norse period, and we've got material from all of these. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Cladh Hallan and then try and put it in context of the other sites. And also, I'll try and put it in context of some very recent results that have been emerged, which I measured today. So I went today and got some more data. Oh, go away. So the best thing about the islands is that they do have this incredibly long record. There hasn't been very much development here, which means that, of course, the archaeological resource is very well preserved. It hasn't been destroyed. There has been this amazing continuous occupation, and some of the sites, people have lived there for thousands of years, so we can actually see what's been happening over this period of time. We have really nice stone architecture, so the walls survive, which at least means we've got something still there we can go and find. And there's lots of sites. Most of the sites that we've excavated are settlement sites. Okay, there are the occasional burial sites, but we're not going to focus on today. And settlements are really good. I mean, burials are great because you get lots of people, you can do things with people. But settlements are great because you understand how people live, how people and their animals live together. And you can find out, I guess, more about the way people live their lives and what they do. And the preservation here is just about fantastic. And that's partly to do with the chemistry and partly to do with the sort of the physical aspects, particularly of the maca. Because it's this beautiful sort of sand that gently settles over the sites. It's put over the sites and just preserves them. Yeah, so it's very, very benign. It's very benign in terms of weather. It doesn't get very hot. It doesn't get very cold. And those extremes are the things that will destroy any sort of biomolecules or will actually affect anything. So that means that here it's this fantastic sort of really good chemical, physically benign environment. So stuff here survives unbelievably well. Also, as you'll see from Cladh Hallan, is because people tended to live in the same place. They just built these amazing deposits. I mean, Cladh Hallan, every time we thought we got to the bottom, we just hadn't got to the bottom again. We just kept digging test pits and thinking, we got to the bottom surely. And all we'd ever dig into was kind of a layer of clean sand that they'd used to level up their floor, tidy it all up. Then we'd realise that there was more underneath it. Because archaeology is always a surprise, isn't it? But it does mean that while we've got the floors in these houses, and what you get from floors is people drop things. And so I've worked at another site called Cladh Hallan, which is a very famous Neolithic site, 9,000 years old, in Turkey. And then working there was really disappointing because the floors were hard, which meant that people just swept them every day. And so you never got the rubbish that people lived in the houses left behind. Whereas in these houses, people dropped something, you stepped on it and it disappeared. And so we can find all of the things that everybody had in the house, because basically if you drop an earring or thing, it just goes. You're never going to get it back. Whereas at Cladh Hallan, all you ever found was the rubbish that somebody else had thrown in the house. You never found the rubbish that was associated with the people living in that house. So the best thing about these soft floor accumulating deposits is you get this record of basically everything that's been lost and left behind. So some of the good stuff you get at Cladh Hallan, which we've recovered by using methodologies Helen's going to talk about, have been the shed teeth of children in their beds. You know, so you find, you know, sort of that sort of level of stuff. So, you know, you can imagine there's a lying in bed at night with tooth. Then you kind of be, maybe they put it under the pillow and the tooth bone. But, you know, those are the sort of things you'll find just sort of embedded in the floor. So some things they put deliberately under and in the floors, but some things they just drop. And that actually is really good. And can give you a good idea of what people were doing in different parts of the house. So that's kind of that's another talk that somebody can give you. But it does mean that we get all of this stuff inside houses. And we dug lots and lots of sites, and over the time we dug them, we basically use standard methods. And because we've done them all the same, it means it's much easier for us to compare them. So I can compare all of my stuff really, really easily. Whereas if I have to compare other people's stuff, they record it in other, obviously less good ways. You know, but it can be problematic trying to convert other people's data. Because we've done so many, it's really great. And as Simon alluded to, kind of over the period of time, obviously in the decades that we've been coming here, what we've seen is this explosion in what's called biomolecular archaeology. And that's when we've realised that we can move from a sort of macroscopic recovery of information, where we just look at stuff, to now we can actually look at stuff microscopically and even kind of sub-microscopically. So that means things like looking at ancient DNA. So these sorts of techniques have emerged over the time we've been looking, and all the time we've been actually beginning to apply and the sites have promoted, premiered, proven, you know, some of this science actually. So we've been very, very lucky, and we've worked with a large team of people to do some of these things. That was just to show you preserved bones, but never mind. So do you want to do?
Yes. I'm just going to talk a little bit, because I think most of this presentation is going to focus on the bone remains and Jacqui's research, because it's, you know, really interesting and a particular feature of the site with regard to environmental evidence, which is what the talk was about. So we haven't got time to talk about everything, but as a background to the recovery of the bone remains, as Jacqui touched on before, is to do the preservation, because animal bones survive well in a calcareous or an alkaline environment, which is what the Maca sand is. You know, we'll all be familiar with that, I'm sure, but you know, it has a high pH, whereas if you're dealing with a site that, say, would be on the east coast where you've got the peat, the acidic environment there would mean that bone doesn't preserve. It would be good for other environmental remains, so we find pollen there and beetle remains and things that, you know, will survive well in waterlogged conditions that we get in the kind of mire environments. So at the beginning of the project, when we first started working up here, there was a really good team of people from Sheffield. We were some of those PhD students, and there were others as well who were bioarchaeologists, and they were working on pollen, looking at the pollen profiles from over on the east, and beetle remains, and sediment analysis to build up a picture of the environment that provides a context for the archaeological sites that we were excavating. And that's kind of the best way of actually approaching archaeology, so that you can understand what's happening on a landscape level and then also at site level. So on the sites themselves, you've got the excellent preservation from the sands, and we find there ecological materials such as the bone, we find marine shells and also land snails as well. They all preserve very well. For plant remains, which is kind of my area, the sand isn't so good for plant preservation in the way that you get most information. They only survive if they're carbonised. So obviously anything that you find that's been carbonised and therefore preserved has gone through a fire, and it has to go through a fire in the correct conditions for preservation. If it's too hot, they'll just burn away completely. So they tend to preserve if they fall through to the embers at the bottom of the fire and burn fairly slowly over a longer period of time. And it's better if the material's fairly dense. So things like cereal grains preserve very well because they're small and dense. and lumps of wood as well that might be used as fuel or could have accidentally gone in there. But unless it's fuel and you're sure it's fuel, you can be pretty sure that the stuff you're looking at is only there because it's accidentally, fallen into the fire. And then when you recover it over the rest of the site, it's gone there because of a secondary activity. So it could be, like Jacqui said, sweeping or something, just removed it from that original area of the preservation, the hearth itself. Or it's been moved away from the hearth and being dumped on the rubbish dump, because we excavate middens at the side of the houses as well. So we do find plant remains, but because it's an accident and there are lots of reasons why the things won't preserve very well, we don't get a very big assemblage of plants. Because lots of stuff would have been eaten in its leafy form and may not have even been taken into the house. They might have been eating things as they're collecting stuff in the environment, wild plants or seeds or nuts and things like that. So not everything makes it back. And we also do lots of soil analysis on the floor, so it's another part of this suite of techniques that we threw at our excavations, pretty much from the beginning, because we started applying those at Dunboolan in a fairly rudimentary way, but they took off at Cladh Hallan and Kilfedder and Bornish and Kildona. Yeah. So we won't do soil analysis at Kildona, but the others have been fairly comparable. So in order to do that and to benefit most from the information that's available, we applied this technique of recovering pretty much things from the houses themselves. When we realised that we've got complete houses with beautiful floors inside them, we were going to be excavating them in their entirety. So we thought open air excavation, where you try to excavate a whole layer at a time, is the best way forward, rather than just digging one part as a sample of what might be there. It's better to interpret it and understand what's happening by doing a layer at a time, a floor at a time. As Jacqui said, we found that we had incredibly deep occupation layers. So in our central house at Cladh Hallan, there were 5 floor layers stacked one on top of the other, going over this very long period of occupation. And it would seem from the dating that each floor represents pretty much a generation. So we can sequence them fairly accurately. So the floors were divided into a grid, 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres, and at each of the intersections a sample would be taken for soil analysis. And then the rest of the 50 centimetre box for any one floor layer would be taken away and would be sieved in its entirety. And by sieving we mean wet sieving, which is where you float off the carbonised material. I'm sure if you're in the archaeology group you know all about that kind of thing. So it's a way of collecting the very delicate remains and land snails, but the heavier stuff would fall through to a mesh. So the floating stuff is recovered down to 300 microns, so that you pick up not just cereal grains, but the tiny weed seeds that will tell you about the fields that the cereals may have grown in, or other wild plants that might have come in with the fuel from the background areas to the site. And then in the 1 millimetre mesh of the residue, we will be picking up all of the things that could be missed just by excavating with your trowel by the naked eye, and all the tiny fragments of bone for Jacqui, any worked bones, bits of gold, worked finds, bits of pottery, or the special things that you might have missed otherwise. So this created a huge number of samples that we couldn't always keep on top of, and we would have to work through those after the actual excavation. Or if we managed to keep up with the wet sieving, we would then be taking back reams of this heavy residue and the floating material that then took months to work through afterwards, with people in the labs just going through with a paintbrush and painstakingly picking out what they think is relevant, and then us checking it and going off to the different specialists. So it was tens of thousands of litres of soil that was sieved and analysed, so it's just been a complete lifetime headache. But worth it, because when you see the results, once you've got your you've got your different specialists starting to look at the material and identifying what they can, and they feed back the data. We plotted those remains, and in the first volume of the site that's already been published, we've got loads of beautiful graphs in there and charts, which are pictures of the outside of the houses, floor by floor, showing you distribution maps of the results, whether it's the physical remains of small bits of pottery or large bits of pottery, or small bits of bone, whether they're burnt or not burnt, or bigger bits of bone, but looking at the distribution. And what we find is that we start to build up a really big picture. Well, I've jumped from the top bit to the evidence. No, sorry, I've just skipped to the bottom part of this slide. So, sorry, I was going to say about the other environmental materials, the pollen and the beetles. Again, some of you might be familiar with this already, but not to go into detail now, but what those studies have told us is that basically we know in the Bronze Age that there's an acceleration in the decline in woodland. So this has started in the Neolithic. We know that the map has been forming around that time before as well. And you get peat formation starting in the sort of the Neolithic and before the Cladh Hallan site. But in the Bronze Age, that stuff really starts to accelerate. So the tree decline is speeding up, and not a surprise, we find peat ash on the site. So we know that they're using the peat, and we're not finding a huge amount of wood being used as fuel. And there's no examples of any destruction where timber might have been burnt in situ, but then we don't really have that on our site anyway. Neil has that at Cornish much later, where there's been an accident and the framework of the house is actually burnt in situ and kind of collapsed. But, so those kind of remains, the pollen and beetles and the soils and sediments in the background landscape help give us a context of what the environment is like for this site. So they've moved to the Maca, they're cultivating it there, we know they've got their animals for farming, and we know that they're growing certain types of crops. So the charred plant remains don't tell us a really riveting story, other than it fits into the sequence that you get on the islands here. But there's a tiny, very small number of wheat grains. You find wheat in the Neolithic, but it just starts to taper off from the Bronze Age onwards. So the climate isn't suited to it because it starts to get damper in the Bronze Age here, and wheat doesn't thrive so well, whereas barley does very well in this environment, as everybody would know. But what you find in the Bronze Age on our site is that you've got more naked barley than whole barley, and again through the Bronze Age into the Iron Age back then. So the difference between those two, for anyone that doesn't know, is that whole barley is called that because the glooms, which is like the chaff that you find around an actual cereal grain or a barley grain, and the glooms are there to protect it, they're tightly bound to the grain, and they therefore affect its morphology. So it grows into those glooms and it has a slightly angular shape. Whereas a naked barley, it still has protective glooms, but they're much looser. So the grain therefore isn't constrained. It's easy to process and get those glooms off, but it isn't constrained in its shape. So it's got kind of a much more rounded and wimpy surface because it hasn't had the glooms attached to it. But the glooms on the whole barley, through time, the reason that people switched to growing only whole barley and they stopped growing naked barley is because those tight glooms protect the grain and probably stop it getting damp and therefore rotting. So it's to do with again suitability for a wetter environment, which is what we certainly have here. So the other thing we find in the plant remains is weed seeds, and it's a selection of, surprise, surprise, sedges and rushes and grass-type families. You can't always identify things when they're carbonised down to specific species level, which is when you get the information you need to really be able to say which exact parts of the landscape you might be targeting. Because different plants are very specific in their requirements. Some like acid conditions, some like alkaline conditions, some prefer drier areas of land to wetter areas of land. And you use that known information from modern plant studies to interpret the stuff that you find in your archaeological sites. And ideally, what we'd like to do from the remains is to work out where they're growing things. Are they changing the areas of land that they choose to cultivate in? Or is it telling us that those areas of land in the landscape are altering slightly? Are they becoming wetter? Or are they doing very intensive cultivation? On some sites where you find amazing assemblages, you can say things like, well, they're fertilising some of these crops and not others, because we've got the weeds of manuring, certain species really like and thrive in nutrient-rich conditions. Or you might find examples of more extensive cultivation where they're just, trying areas of land that are less fertile. Yes, the next slide. And then, so that was very briefly on that bit, but the other main thing about the recovery of materials as samples from the sites in this way was looking at the spatial distribution. So all of the materials enable us to pick up a pattern of activities, as Jacqui said, because things getting trampled into the floor and pretty much will be representing activities that would have been going on there because things are being dropped, and they are the things that are the remnants of people working, living. So we were testing a hypothesis that someone had postulated for the Iron Age a long time ago, and it's this idea of sunwise living. So you have a roundhouse in the Iron Age. Our site is obviously a Bronze Age through to early Iron Age. So we thought it'd be really good when we knew we've got these floors that we could try and test this hypothesis by having this sample retrieval strategy. we're kind of, boldly predicting, oh well, what are you going to find in that quadrant, because we divided the site into southeast quadrants, southwest quadrants, northwest and northeast. So we were kind of predicting what you get where, and saying, well, the southeast should be, that's going to be the cooking area, and then the southwest will be where the craft activities are, and the northwest will be the sleeping area, and the northeast, well, we're not quite sure, it's where it's like a bit dark, and so many things happen. And then lo and behold, we told the students this, and you were thinking, like, it's probably not going to happen. And then lo and behold, as we're excavating, this is before we look at the microdebitage, just from the finds on the floor, we start to realise that this pattern is actually happening. It was the most amazing thing. So in the southeast, you're finding larger chunks of pottery, so vessels from food storage or from cooking, and burnt pottery as well. So you knew you're looking at the remains of cooking and bigger fragments of bone, animal bone, burnt and unburnt, from the processing of, food. So a cooking area. It's like, there's a bronze age kitchen.
And you find the bed.
Well, then the southwest, we went into the craft area where we were finding loom weights and bone points and things like that, but they weren't turning up in the other areas, so they were very much concentrated in the southwest area. So you could imagine that they've got, upright looms or whatever else set up in this area. And then in the northwestern quadrant, which we said would be for sleeping, the actual ground was raised up, so what we could see is that they brought in what looked like macateurs because of the, through insection, you've got deep sandy areas and then there's small soil horizon that obviously decompose, but it was like a turf had been brought in and built up this nice free draining bed area. The soil analysis showed higher phosphorus levels here, which we said again, you haven't got nappies at this period, so it's probably babies lying in the bed and just having to urinate, and you've got the teeth. We found that bird bone, didn't we? So it tucked under a pillow. Was it?
Yes, it was cool.
No, it's quite a long. Was it? It wasn't a store. I can't remember what it was now. It was something, but otherwise devoid of things. You're not getting pottery there or bone. You get small amounts, so it's not completely, devoid of everything, but just not in the same numbers as the other areas. And then in the northeastern area, not many of any of these types of remains at all. And we were thinking, well, okay, there's not much there which fits the theory, but what is there going to be? And that was when we were getting to the bottom of these sites. In the primary deposits, well, underneath the first floor, we were finding the pits where we've got the amazing mummies in their pits. So they were foundation deposits. So it almost represented this idea of, it being the zone of the dead or the ancestors. So it was incredible. And I'm going to shut up otherwise. The entire Jacqui to talk about amazing animal bones.
Excuse me. This is just an example here of sort of how many people does it take to analyse the site. So this is just the people that we've had. So everything we do, so this is basically anything to do with, I suppose, animals, is, we have specialists, we have Sally as well, we have specialists, lots of people who've done PhDs, lots of people who've done masters projects, who do lots of books and papers, people who do birds, people who do mollusks, people who do fish. So then we can think about lots of people who do all sorts of things to do with biomolecular analysis, where you grind stuff up and find things out. Then we also have people who look at the work tools, people who look at where all the stuff is lying around. We had a student who wrote quite a bit on the dogs, because the dogs are quite interesting. We have people who looked at the animal remains, so you find food remains in pottery vessels, and you can use an analysis to find out what those are. So basically, if you find, I'll come into it later, actually, I won't do anything else now. Yes, but you can find things out. So I'm going to tell you bits about, the main species, and then some other points about other research. So basically, main species, and we'll also talk about domestic and wild animals. So, you give an introduction to the site. So this is kind of, again, another picture of the site under excavation. This is an earlier picture, as in earlier in our excavation than the one you just saw. Basically, there's three houses sort of next to each other, and there's a little person stood in a post hole, I think, and it's this kind of terrace of houses. And what happens is, the houses kind of go in and out of use, but the house in the middle, house 401, is the one that lasts the longest period of time. And there's actually 16 phases. So archaeologists divide time up into these things called phases, where basically events happen. So Cladh Hallan starts actually with a cremation cemetery. So it starts with somebody goes there and starts to plough. You can see the plough marks and spade cultivation under the house. Then they start to cremate people on a stone platform, and they bury their cremations and these little kind of stone cairns around the site. We found all of them. Then they sort of that goes out of use, and then they put the houses in. So they start with one big house, they build out on the side, the side houses contract back in, the big house carries on, and then they build some other dwellings around it. But basically, there's people there for a very long period of time. So whatever it is, there's something very important about that spot. Why they chose it, we don't know. But we also know that the site actually still continues under the sand dunes, and there's still other remains there to this day. So whatever it was a very important place. People lived there, and they lived there for over 1,000 years. Well, we have evidence of them being there for over 1,000 years. So this was just a little infographic that we made for the article in Current Archaeology, I think, yes. So, you know, you can see we dug that site for 9 years. The houses we built 6 times. We brought over 200 workers with us. So it's 39,883 litres of soil was sealed. 27,000 small finds, 350 bronze casting mould fragments. So at the site, this is another talk. The site was obviously, I'm going to talk about animals, but the site was also a place where people cast bronze. We find sword moulds, we find dagger moulds. So they're bringing bronze to the island and they're then casting it. We found this most amazing gold herring. That wasn't found in the West Sydney, by the way, because it's quite big. It's absolutely amazing tiger stripe. If you Google gold, Cladh Hallan, you can find it. It's astounding. It's a gold herring that's made of 2 different types of gold, and what they've done is they've annealed a silver sort of gold onto this ring, and it looks like this amazing tiger stripe, but it's supposed to be an earring, so they say. You know, there's six, oh hello, come in. You know, so there's 6 burials, there's about 16 generations of occupation. You know, 9 cremation burials with 1 million ecofracts, 80 floor layers, you know, 75,000 pottery shells. I didn't weigh the animal bones. 150,000 animal bones were recorded by me and other people. So I'm just going to remind you, you must all know about the famous mummies. Anyway, there was a series of human burials that were found, and on analysis we discovered that they weren't just one individual, they were in fact composite bodies. And the most famous one is this individual who's a male who was made up of 3 different people whose remains dated to 3 different time periods. So this person, it's on the Meet the Ancestors program and stuff, so this person was found really tightly crouched. The chances are that they were preserved above ground and actually tightly bound, which is why they're kind of so kind of crouched. And their heads at a slightly funny angle, and what there actually is the skull and the neck belong to one individual, the body belongs to a second individual, and the mandible belongs to a third individual. And what they've done is they've put this one person back together and they've buried them. And there's other human burials as well that show similar sort of manipulation, their composite bodies. Why? We don't know. But whatever it was so these people had been kept above ground for a long period of time, or they'd been recovered from somewhere else. So the question is, I guess, what happens to make them have to be buried under these houses?
Several hundred years earlier, and the floor layer that's above them, the first floor of the house, had been occupied. So we did carbon dating, and so we knew that there were older individuals that had been preserved or curated somewhere and then buried once they started to live.
So this is actually a habit. This is a practice that continues through. So if you know, I mean, at Solace, for example, you find a teenage boy who's quartered and placed under the floor of the roundhouse at Solace. So there's various sort of practices that kind of go on. I mean, there's no evidence of any injury to these individuals, but whatever it is about them is that they were very, very important, and they were actually centred in the houses. And there was something about living with your dead. It's the other one, Jacqui, they've got hundreds of people under their floors as well. That's what humans do, it seems. But also, once they stopped burying people, they did carry on burying animals. So we'll come back to, there's a sheep. There's a picture of the sheep, there's a dog, and in fact there's loads of dogs' feet, which again, hopefully I'll come back to. So after they stop burying people, they bury animals, and again, this is something that happens elsewhere. So, lots and lots of bones, lots and lots of bones. So across here is time, really. So this is the beginning of the site to the end, and you should be able to see just by looking. There's small numbers there, there's big numbers in the middle, and they get smaller again. Okay. This is just a list of all the species I found. Sheep goat is just because you can't tell sheep from goat a lot of the time. Pig cattle, pigs, dogs, and cats we have. Cats, there's not very many cats, unfortunately. Cats probably don't become common until the Iron Age. I always think it's very funny because cats arrived at the same time as house mice arrived. I think there was somebody dealing house mice, dealing cats, came around, let go some mice, and they went, hey guys, do you want to do this? It's actually really difficult to tell wild cats from domestic cats because, I don't think you must know, they're not particularly different in size. So it could have been a wild cat, we don't know, we'd have to do genetic testing on that. There's lots of red deer, gazillions of red deer. There's even some roe deer, but I'm not convinced that there was actually a roe deer population because I don't think there's enough roe deer. I think people might have been trading bits in, but that's one of those things. You see there's bits of otters, there's hares / rabbits, they're probably hares. The problem, of course, with the rabbits, as you all know, is that they burrow, so they tend to get into the archaeological sites and they're a bit annoying. We find that people went and gathered seals, so we have common seals and the grey Atlantic seals, and we also have some sorts of rodents, insectivores, and we got a lizard, well, yes, we got a slow worm in fact, would you believe, one mandible of a slow worm. Yeah, I know, but the person who identified that was not me. So, I mean, whenever you're thinking about animals on islands, you're always thinking, where did they come, when did they arrive, where did they come from, what were they used for, and what happened over time. So, when did things arrive? Did they arrive very early, with the earliest humans? Who, did they arrive, who would have been hunter-gatherers? Did they arrive with the farmers? Because, so for example, the Inner Hebrides is a very rich Mesolithic heritage. Yes, so there's lots of stuff on Oronsay, and all around that area where you can see lots of people, there's these great sites, massive shell middens and things, but the evidence out here is sparser, but there is some evidence. It's very hard trying to get the people who do the work to tell me what it is they found. I think they found a bit of antler and possibly some hairs in terms of animals. So yes, you have to get the evidence. You can sometimes look at genetic history of animals, and you can think about also if people have livestock, how are they husbanding it? And then I can also look at changes in shape and size, which can tell me various things about what's happening with the animals. So we have the big four, which is unusual for any site in Britain, because everywhere else there's a big three. The weird thing about the islands is the prevalence of red deer and their importance. It's very strange. It's actually unheard of in all of Britain, and it's not very well known in most of Europe. There's something about the islands that means that deer continue to be a key resource right the way through, but I'll tell you more about that later. So the most important ones, the big one, of course, is sheep. There's lots of sheep. Then there's quite a lot of cows. There's some large amount of deer, and very, very few pigs. We saw some pigs yesterday, got very excited. Scots people, oh my God, there's pigs. There's lots of conversations about why people don't have pigs on the islands, but we can come on to that. So what we do is we use a really funky way of counting, but basically all this is showing you, what you're going to need to know, is there's lots of blue. So all the way through time, sheep are the most common animal that people rear, okay? The next most common is the green, which is the cow, so there's lots of cows. These are just the two colours, the two shades of the colour just tell you there's different ways of counting. And this is to make sure that you're counting correctly, basically. It's to do with how many bones can you get in a skeleton and how broken up are they. So you count it in two different ways. So there's loads of sheep, there's less cows, there's a reasonable amount of deer, and sometimes they're almost as common as the cows. And then you can see there's not very many pigs. Okay? The other things we can do is we look at all the different sorts of bones. So this is just a list of all the different types of bones, and we look at which bits of the body are present. I'm not going to talk very much about that, but you can see it's a bit weird here. So sheep, okay, you've got them, you farm them, you probably take them home and kill them. But don't appear to be taking all of them home because there's no toes. Sheep toes are quite small and hard to find, but we sieve everything, so they should be there. Okay, so then you have cattle, you have more of the toes, whatever. But then the deer are a bit weird because these are a hunted species. you imagine you go off to the hills and you just come back with the good bits. But for some reason, they're bringing back they appear to be bringing lots of the bits back, and we'll find out why. Later on, we'll find out, well, one of the reasons why we end up with all of the bodies of these animals. Because the idea is if you hunt something, you don't take home everything, because why would you take the lower valued meat back with you? But they do seem to be fairly keen on taking stuff back that you wouldn't particularly expect. So they take back things, you know, you can think about the forelimbs, so you know, your nice shoulder joints, and the back limbs, they bring them all back. So there's a bit of a hint that they're not taking as much, there's not as much as domestic stock, but they're treating them very much like domestic stock. So there's a crazy way of counting. So basically, I counted, and there's a minimum of 300 sheep on my site, which over 1,000 years isn't very much, but that's to do with the crazy way you count things, okay? But it's, in terms of archaeological assemblages, it's one of the biggest assemblages in Britain, really. So it doesn't seem like a lot when you divide it up, but it's, the way we count is quite a lot. So the sheep are great. The sheep are quite small. You can see the average one's about sort of 58 centimetres high. And that's about the same, slightly taller than a Surrey, about the same size of Shetland sheep. So they're not particularly large sheep. Modern domestic sheep are much bigger, you know, they're kind of meter. So they're small sheep, and they're small in the Bronze Age, they get smaller in the Iron Age, and they get bigger in the Bronze period. So that's what these colours are telling you. So one of the things that we do is we spend a lot of our time looking at animals' teeth to work out how old they are. So what lots of people have done is got lots of animals, and they know what age they are, and their teeth wear down in a pattern that allows you to work out how old they are. So by looking at the teeth of the animals, we can work out how old they are. So this is all of the animals from all of the sites, all stuck together, okay? So we do this analysis, this is all the different phases, and basically sheep are just being, basically, there's figures telling you they're doing the same things with sheep. Lots of them live. You know, there's not many of them killed between 0 and 6 months, lots of them are killed between 6 and 12 months, and then they tail off. What does that mean? So somebody else came up with a model, and they went and spoke to lots of shepherds and said, if you're going to kill sheep for particular things, what would you kill them for? So this is kind of like the model. So the things you could use sheep for would be milk, so in some societies sheep are milked. You could use them for meat, you could use them for wool, and the ones on Cladh Hallan appear to be fitting best to this kind of dark line, which is hiding into that grey line. So they're raising them for meat. They're not actually using them for wool. But that's not unexpected, because sheep aren't woolly until much later in the Bronze Age. And actually the sheep, there's very good evidence in Scotland for wool in the Iron Age, but not before that. So they're not, you're allowed to keep them for wool because they're not woolly. The genetic evidence that we have suggests that something happens later in the Bronze Age, and it might be the arrival of wool. But I'm still waiting for the person to finish that piece of research for us. So you're eating your sheep. The cows are tiny. They can only, so in order to work out how tall an animal is, you really need a complete bone, and because they tend to use them sort of so intensively, they chop most of them up. So the cattle, we only managed to work out how tall 2 cows were, which is not very good. But they're 107 and 108 centimetres to their shoulders. So they're about the size of modern dexters, which are kind of like the kind of pocket cows, you know, you can carry around them. And they don't really change in size. So you've got quite small sheep, you've got quite small cows. So I mean, you can see the size of the dexters here. So they're not the giant beasts that you might think. And again, this is just showing you changes in size. You don't need to know what this says. All it's saying is they don't really change in size very much, okay? Where were they kept? So one of the fun things about Cladh Hallan is you get cow footprints outside the houses. So you can see that they were standing kind of in the leeward side of the house, and at one particular period of time they all stood there. Then the wind, the clean sand blew in, and somehow it all got covered. And you can see, and you can see those little double footprints. So the cattle all stood. There's also some suggestion that, so this house, isn't it? I think it's this, which house? I don't know, 1, 2, 3. I think it was this house went out of use first, and there's evidence from the residues that they may have been putting their cows in the houses that went out of use. So the idea, you know, they're black houses and people that live with the animals, you know, if you think about it, you want to look after your cows, you probably need some shelter for them in winter. The other crazy, well, there's one of the great things you get is you get loads and loads of these things. These are scapular shovels. So they would make shovels out of the shoulder blades of the animals, and there's loads of them. It's one of the biggest collections of scapular shovels ever recovered. And also, so you can tell they've been used as shovels because they tend to adapt them, and what they do is they kind of shape them a bit. So you kind of shape this end a bit, there's a big spine, chop that off, then you attach it to a piece of wood with some string, twine or sinew, and then you can use it as a digging tool. But the crazy thing is, so these are most of them, and then there's these two over here, which are much bigger, and I've been back and measured them 3 times, because every time I keep thinking I've just made a mistake, but I've actually finally accepted that what they were doing was they were importing larger ones from somewhere, or they were keeping larger ones. So these are not from their cows, and I don't know where they're getting them from, but they've got these massive ones, so somebody's turned up with a big shovel and said, or you kept one, maybe it was an early one, who knows. We can also tell what sex the cows are by looking at DNA. So you can look at size and shape, but really the best way to do it is to get somebody to spend lots of time, money and effort actually looking at what sex they are. So we've been using ancient DNA, and so somebody did a study of 63 samples across Britain and Ireland, and basically found what you would expect is that there's more female cattle than male cattle found on any archaeological site. So if you think about it, males, pain in the ass. How many of them do you need, everybody? So at Cladh Hallan, we have 8 to 1. So we have 8 females to 1 male, and that's to do with what you need, what you use them for. So you'd only keep lots of males if you wanted them as oxen or draft animals. Apart from that, you want your cows because you're going to milk them, don't you? Yeah. So we use 2 different ways, and both ways basically told us. So this is, if you're really clever, well, you can use DNA and look at the mandibles, so we can tell how old the animal was and what sex it was. You see what I mean? So we know that under 6 months they're killing all the males to get them out of the way because you don't need them, and then as they get older they're keeping all the females, which seems quite obvious, but believe you me, you've got to prove everything in archaeology. So we've done that work. So again, we do the same sort of things, spend lots of time looking at cows' teeth to work out how old they are. And the observant view will notice that loads of them die really, really early. So something like around 50% of the animals die in the first month of life. Okay? And about 40 to 80% of them are dead by 8 months. So there's been lots of arguments about why this occurs. Why would you kill little baby calves? Because if you think about it, the models are always like you're gonna wait for them to grow until they get big, and then you'll kill them in the autumn. So why would you kill them? So there's a number of theories to do with this, and again, somebody came up with lots of models about what you use them for. And this guy called Tony Legg came up with a model that he said would fit milking. So he came up with a model, and he said that if you wanted to liberate milk for the use of humans, you would kill calves. He said you would kill them slightly later because you need the calves to actually instigate the milking. There's various ways you can get around that if you're a clever farmer. There's various things you can do with ethnographies. And also, I think it may have been on the islands that there was a limit to the amount of animals that you wanted. And in fact, if you killed the calves earlier, then that was kind of the most efficient. But whatever it is, it's only on these islands that they do this model. Well, actually, it's not true. They do it in Ireland as well, but it's kind of a very West Coast phenomenon. And we think it's linked to actually liberating milk for consumption. So the reason why we think this is because what we've actually all done, let me try and understand this goddamn graph. Oh, here we go. Is that if you look, hang on, dairy fats in pots, just focus on this bit here, is that basically in Britain, the minute that cattle are introduced, you find milk in pottery, okay? And we can do this by doing this analysis of what we find in pots. We can actually take the lipids out of the pots, and we can find out that they were animal fats, and we can find out if they're ruminant fat, or porcine fat, or surdid fat. And what we find in the pots at Cladh Hallan is that there's milk in all the pots. So we know that they're actually producing the milk. You know, they are getting milk. Chances are you're making milk and then rapidly turning it into something else, probably something storable. You're probably not drinking a pint of milk at the end of the day, because basically it'll go off, so you'll be turning it into something. I know you think about these things, you find bog butter and stuff, you can find stored in the bogs around various parts of Scotland and stuff, and Ireland. So we think that have this specialised way of managing cattle, so they don't have too many cattle at any one time pressing on the resources, but what they're actually doing is killing the calves in order to get this milk, which is this storable product. Okay. I'll pass over that. Pigs, yeah, pigs don't tell you very much. Basically, you just find out that most of your pigs die young because obviously pigs don't give you anything other than meat. So they tend to be killed quite young and when they're very tasty. So this is just telling you that most of them die. This is a slight graph. There's not very many pigs, and I sometimes wonder whether there was a pig community here, but there are some piglets, which makes you think that they are actually breeding them. And later on we can find out things like what they're eating. So we know that at certain points people are feeding the pigs fish waste, which is interesting. So red deer. So red deer are much more important than pigs. So they come to Britain about 11,000 years ago, and they have a very, very complicated sort of management strategy. I mean, they're virtually rare in Wales, where I live at the moment, and it's all to do with deforestation and human disturbance. And what happens is they go down in their abundance, but then Victorians become very interested in deer, and then they start to improve the deer. So they introduce deer from various parts. And because of this kind of new rise in stalking and hunting. So they have a kind of complex history. So Britain has the largest European population of red deer. We have a population in excess of 350,000. I suspect that those dots are quite accurate, but that's the most recent map I could find. Wales, those ones there have just escaped from a deer farm, they're not native. It's very disappointing. And Britain itself is an island refuge, and the Hebrides in particular are important because the Sika deer, so the Sika deer can come from Europe and they're a breed of deer, then they can breed with the red deer. But obviously they haven't actually made it to the Lewis yet, so Lewis still has some of the purest deer in Britain. Deer, so this is what happens. In the Mesolithic, we know they're there, we know they're in the inner Hebrides, and we know they're kind of across Britain, alright, so there's quite a lot of them. Then what happens is they start to appear in the islands, and we know that in the Neolithic what happens is the farmers introduce deer to the islands. We don't think they're there beforehand. They introduce them. In Orkney, they also introduce foxes for fur. What else? They introduce something else for fur. So basically what you have to appreciate is that these farmers, when they arrived, they weren't just arriving with sort of domestic stock, they were kind of seeding the islands. And it's something that lots of people do later when they go out voyaging. There's like sheep islands and goat islands. So you take some animals, you kind of chuck them off onto the island, you wait for them to grow, and then you go back and get them every time you sail past. That's what people used to do when they were like voyaging. So the idea is, so basically people arrived, they obviously arrived with a calf, a sheep, a piglet, and some deer, and they let them go onto the islands. And then what happens is they become a kind of a key point of those sort of food and resources. So they do that, they do it later on the island, and eventually somebody takes them to the Isles of Scilly, would you believe, and lets them go there. They don't must on there because it's quite small. And then over time they begin to disappear. And what happens actually in Orkney is they're hunted to extinction. And so the Earls write home complaining that they have to go across to the Cape Ness to go hunting. It's like, we come over here and there's nothing for us to do. We're going to go over there because there's no deer, it's outrageous. But deer survive here all the way through, and so you know they're still here. You also probably know that counting deer is quite hard. So counting deer archaeologically is hard because lots of people sometimes count the bits of antler as if they're like bits of bones. So sometimes it's this thing about using one method. So it can become quite complicated because people count antler. And antler is obviously shed, so you can get more than one bit of antler than one deer. So I don't do that. Okay. So the questions I'm always asking is, are the deer local or traded? How big are the populations? Are they breeding populations? How have they been used? And then we look at the antler. Is it shed? Is it unshed? And we've got some examples behind us of, you know, what people have been using the antler for. Because the antler is an incredibly important resource. So antler and whalebone were two enormously important resources in an island with very little trees. Okay. So people used large bits of whalebone for structural items, but they also used antler to make all of the things that you might otherwise see kind of made in wood. But because they're made in bone and lots of them in antler, they preserve really well, so we can see them, you know. So I think she's, so the weaving comb is probably, is sort of Iron Age we could find. The composite comb is a later Norse object. And the other thing is, how big are the deer here, okay? So we spend lots of time looking at all of the different sort of bits of evidence to try and find out what's happening with the deer. So we look at their body parts. I spend a lot of time looking at kind of what the deer eat, what happens to them, what the DNA tells us about them, trying to identify what species deer are. And there's a thing you can use DNA, that's quite expensive. You can use another thing called zooms, which is basically looking at proteins. And that's like a tenner a sample, whereas DNA is like hundreds of pounds a sample, and you have to persuade somebody to do it. Okay? We can look at where people find deer to see how important they are, and then we can kind of look at ethnographic and historical models to see what people are doing with them. So I've got deer, and so what are they doing with the deer? So the idea is they're supposed to be, you know, a species that you would go out and just hunt as an adult. If you think about it, you go out, you imagine you'd be going out and getting, you know, those nice plump sort of, you know, prime deer, that's what you're going to get. But what they actually do is they do get them, so you can see here, this is where they're going out and killing like the sub-out adult deers, that's what you expect them to do. But what they're also doing is they're popping out and getting the baby deer. So what they do, like they do for the calves, is they go out and kill the fawns. We know they kill them to eat them because they have butchery marks on them. So we can find that they're not just taking them back for their spotty coats, they're actually consuming them. Because the butchery on them is telling you that they're eating them. So why would you kill, so that you might kill them because of their beautiful spotty coats. And in fact, hold on, no, I haven't got a picture of the underpants, have I? So I don't know, but you must know about Ötzi the Iceman. If you ever go and see Ötzi in the museum or read about him, he has the most amazing leather underpants. And they're actually made of like calf skin. So if you think about it, in a society that had there's no wool, remember, you could probably comb your sheep and make some fancy stuff out of it. But fine leather would have been a really good resource. So when we have quite a lot of leather working tools, so it might have been that they were using the deer skins, the adult deer, the cattle, the sheep, whatever, and maybe the calves, but also a lovely soft fawn would make a nice little set of undergarments, I think. I'm waiting to find some preserved in a bog. And also the other thing that we think, if you remember I was talking to you about basically, it's possible that they're managing the number of cattle by killing the calves. It's the best way to go. You don't want your herd to expand, you don't need it to expand, because you haven't got masses, then you'll get rid of the calf, get the milk, and just keep going. At that point, of course, controlling breeding in your cattle, that's another conversation. But we think this is probably also a tool for deer management, because what you didn't want was the deer to come down, get in the way, eat all your crops, do all those sorts of things. And actually it's really easy to catch fawns, because fawns have this thing called bracco thingy, isn't it? Bracco. Anyway, it means that if you frighten them, they stay still. So their response to danger is they just go, which means you can just pick them up. Yes. So instead of having to go out and like shoot them and lose things, you can just go and pick up the fawn and bring it home and we've got 4 deer, 100 pounds. Things are going really well. No one else. So the only other places we find this is in very, very early sites in Europe. Nobody else in Britain shows this sort of intensity relationship with the deer. Nobody else farms the deer to the same degree. Because what happens elsewhere in Britain is when farming arrives, people give up in all wild resources. They just give them up. You'll find antler picks at places like Stonehenge and things, but basically deer, the relationship with deer just disappears. Because once you've got your domestic stock, you're like, that's it, I'm not doing that anymore. And the whole relationship with wild animals disappears. But here, it might be because of the nature of the land, that the best way to survive on the land was to exploit all of those uplands by letting the deer run around on them. Okay, so what they came up with here was this kind of like amazing method of actually balancing the land and also managing the deer, and they did it for thousands of years. They sustained themselves for thousands of years running this system. Oh, and I mean, you get some beautiful deer bone tools, you know, and some of them look like they were actually kind of the spear-like tools they were possibly doing like catching them with. As I said earlier, they obsessed with digging. So we get loads and loads of these antler picks, so they're made from shed antler. And again, they could be tools for kind of creating the semi-subterranean houses, but they're probably to do with gardening, to do with like field cultivation. And we know that they're used because they shape them and then they're worn. So we've also got this massive collection of these antler picks. And one of the biggest collections in Britain of those. So the deer are very important. Deer, I mean, they don't really, they're quite small. They don't really change in size over time. So basically, from what we know, is that by the time we get to Cladh Hallan, which is kind of the biggest collections of material on late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, animals are actually quite small. If we compare them with earlier animals on the mainland, they would be bigger. We still don't know kind of what happens and why they all shrink yet. I'm involved in a project where we're gathering all the data from the Western Isles and the Orkney Isles and trying to kind of map all that together to try and see what happens and when it happens. Oh, you can tell how old animals are, look at their size. So these are a series of antler that Annie gave me. So I plotted all the Cladh Hallan deer. So this is measuring 2 diameters against the North Uis deer. And you can see that they're probably about a similar size in terms of the antler. So they're not large, they're not particularly small either ways. We have done some work looking at the genetics of the deer and where they're introduced from, and the answer is we're not sure. So we're doing more genetic data on that, and that's again part of this new project we're doing. I've also been able to calculate, using some crazy maths, the contribution of meat, okay? So what I've done is I've converted because I know how many lambs there are, I know how many adult sheep there are, and I've converted all of those. I've worked out, given the number of proportions of the animals, basically what proportion of meat are each of the animals contributing. So basically the sheep are blue, the cows are brown, things are orange, and the pigs are red. And what you should be able to see is that even though there's smaller numbers of cattle, they're probably still giving the most amount of meat because they're so much bigger than the sheep, okay? So I think, I don't know, 1 cow's worth 5 sheep or something. But also you can see that pigs are providing nothing, but they're actually eating a large amount of red deer as well. Which is just crazy, because no one else does that. They're regular venison. We've got loads of dogs on the site. I think we've got like 12 dogs in total. We've got one of the tallest dogs in prehistoric Britain. It's 62 centimetres high. It's quite big, I mean it's not massive, it's a reasonable size. There's not very many puppies, but then it's really hard. The puppies might just not survive, which is always really disappointing. But what we do find them is we find them as burials in the houses. There's 2 dogs that are buried in the middle of the house, either side of the hearth. Like they're fire dogs. You know, they're actually sort of protecting the hearth, and so there's 2 dogs buried. And also we find loads and loads of feet. I can't believe it, there's like 12 feet that are all associated with dogs. And I think there might be something to do with dog skins. They might have been keeping the dogs and skinning them because quite often, you know, if you think about bear skins and things, you get the feet often left in them. That's just my theory, that's another thing. Oh, and also, I don't know if you can see, the dogs, oh no. The dogs have got very warm teeth. Where have I gone? Why can't I see where it was? Is it that one? Ah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, because the picture of the dog will come up. Yeah, so they've got very warm teeth. And it kind of looks like the dogs were sat chewing things, like sticks and things or something. It could be sand, but it does look like the dog's got something sort of, it's just basically sat chewing stuff for quite a long period of time. Whether it's chewing on bones or not, we don't know. So the dogs are very interesting. Oh, there you are. You should be able to see that the dogs are actually, there's one dog, there's the other dog. Where's the other dog? Put your glasses on, Jacqui. Dog 1, dog 2, that's a tag picture. But they're actually lying sort of across the door near the fire. So if you come in, you know, they're kind of protecting the house symbolically. So basically, the settlements are self-contained. There's something unusual that goes on in the islands just in terms of the land mammals. We can go on into what they do with them whales. They have a completely different way of managing animals to everywhere else. They're kind of like, they're more like the hunter-gatherers because they're actually hunter-farmers. And it's just a really unusual model, but is unique here. It's quite similar to what they start off with in Orkney. So it appears in Orkney, but then what happens through time is the deer die out there. But here, the deer continue to be important into the Viking phase. And I don't mean you know that here, South Uist is one of 3 antler comb production sites. One's Dublin, one's York, and one's Bornish. And I suspect that one of the reasons why the Vikings were interested in here was because they could access deer, which they were used to hunting back in Norway, and also because they could access antler. And there was so much antler that they set up a workshop making these combs, which are one of their most important items. And there's something like 12 Viking burials down the islands. Most of them are found buried with combs, because these combs are really important items that they're very, very personal to you. Combs are not for combing your hair to look good, they're for cleaning your hair. You use them, and they're very, very personal, so people are buried with them. Some of them are massive, these combs. So there's something here about the deer that makes people come and carry on using it. So, and the Norse actually do adopt the same practices from the tip of the Norse, but they also go out and get the baby deer. They've gone like, guys, what are you doing? And they just join in. Anyway. Oh, that's for crafts and creativity, you know. So, this is a site that I think you might have heard of. This is a site that's been recently discovered, and it's got Neolithic pottery and Neolithic flint. So today, I just went to see, because that's how this site would fit in with my kind of narrative. So I looked at the bones. So we've got some sheep, some deer, and we got some cattle. But what I did was I did some measurements to work out how tall the animals were, or how big they were compared to the Bronze Age ones. Because what happens is, I think things are introduced in the Neolithic, they're quite large, and then they shrink quite rapidly. Probably because of the environment isn't quite as nice as it is in southern Britain, or wherever it is they come from. So you can see that the Neolithic, so the sheep from the site is much bigger than any of the Bronze Age sheep. There's some, okay? The cattle are bigger, and then the deer antler is also bigger. So that's telling me that these actually are, so that site is actually one of a very early site, and this is some of the earliest stuff that's being introduced to the island. So it's a very important site. So that's what I was doing today. So you've got another site which is going to add to that story, and again it's telling me, you know, like, that the animals were introduced early on, the deer were introduced, which we kind of know.
Sorry, where is that site?
Where is that site?
That's at Kildown, near where the road glass enters the sea. We were excavating there in August last year. I've been keeping an eye on it for about 10 years now, saying we should do something about it. It looks important. Oh, no, it's all right.
I know, I was very excited today. I was going, have you got more? Bring out the rest of it.
The bone preservation is phenomenal.
Yes.
For such an early site. I mean, it's Neolithic bone. And it looks so it was put there a couple of days ago.
Yeah, so that's
plants.
Yes, there is some plants. So the other thing that we've been doing is we've been coming back and basically trying to tell people about kind of the antler crafts. So we were here in September, and we've had some workshops telling people what a great material antler is to make things with. And so we work with the school and with Coram and Windsay and Cheval and things. So we ran a series of workshops because basically we've been going to Glastonbury Festival and promoting South Lewis for over a decade now. So we've been going and teaching people how to work Antler and telling everybody about this material and about the story of the island. And we wanted to come back and get people here to understand that, in fact, you have this kind of rich crafting heritage, which is highly unusual, and but it's very easy material to work, so anybody can actually work Antler. You just need basic sort of woodworking skills, and then you can recreate lots of objects that we had in the past, like the combs or whatever, or you can make up your own new beautiful pendants and things, which these are all the kids from the school who all made kind of like necklaces, didn't they? And then various people kind of riffed around making other items, including necklaces and needles and things like that. So we were sort of trying to get people to maybe think about making some of these items and selling them, because they're quite easy to produce, they're quite cheap, they would reflect the cultural heritage of the island. I mean, if any of you have ever been to Orkney and seen the sort of the heritage industry there that's around their archaeological sites, you can literally buy a ring that is the ring of vodka. You know, so I mean, and they're very, very good at actually packaging and repackaging and thinking about kind of like, they've got sort of silks and linens that have been inspired by the plans of the sites and things. So I mean, I think, well, we think that there's lots of room for the archaeology of Lewis to kind of make a contribution to, I guess, to the economic and and financial stability of the islands, not just by attracting people here to look at it, but by actually kind of, I suppose, regaining or rediscovering some of those craft and cultural aspects. So Sally's going to talk about.
It's another project that we were doing that we've been working on Skye and on Shetland, and also we've done some stuff on Lewis too as part of the Antler workshop. So I don't know if you filled in surveys for us, so it's just to like give you an update on why we were asking you to fill those in really. So the other projects we've been working on are mainly looking at engagement in a way that doesn't sort of exclude anybody, so how to help everybody get involved if they want to, obviously, in heritage and sort of what it means to them in different island communities really. So we were looking at what barriers there are, particularly in islands, but a lot of the barriers affect rural communities too, and then how to sort of overcome them. So then, it's just really quick. So this is just some of the, we did a series of different things in Skye, Shetland and the Antler workshops on Lewis. So we ran like mapping workshops where teaching people to use GIS mapping software. So that's like an online one. We also did coastal surveys, also kind of specific ones which were in Shetland working with an ability group up there, and then with other groups kind of focusing on employment and things like that. And then we did work in the archives as well, and then we were asking people who were coming to the workshop whether they normally get involved in heritage events. Or whether this was the first time. This is what we sort of found, so you can see, I'm sure it's slightly blurry, isn't it? But the archive workshops.
Same old.
Yeah, same old, until you get to the Antler workshops, and then there's like loads of new people coming, which was just fantastic to see that. And it's the same with the age groups as well, and mostly, it's difficult to get the kids involved, the younger groups, but the Antler workshops, again, there were younger people coming to the Antler workshops, and normally, like, sometimes 16-year-olds and stuff aren't as keen to get involved in archaeology and history and stuff, so it was just some interesting results that we saw there. So we're hoping to work with kids in the future, kind of using this on different island groups as well.
So we're just saying thank you to everybody. So lots of people have sponsored us and helped us over the years, and this is only a very short list because I'm out of energy. But thanks, yes, well, can I thank everybody here actually, because I think all of you have contributed in some way, and thank you for coming and listening to us talk tonight. And if you have any questions, let us know, and we do have beautiful Antler to look at. Yes, Annie?
I have two questions, if
Sure.
I can remember them. The first one was, when you showed that the skeleton and it was all curled up in heaven, like were, did they find that with a bit different body parts from the same period? Like they were from the same time period. It wasn't like, oh, this was like a leader that they kept putting their head in. Do you know what I mean? Or what, you know, were they all from the same time period?
No, they were from different time periods.
So they're all older than the floor, which is the
Yeah.
important thing.
So it was what was the body was the oldest bit, wasn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
about
Yes.
500 years
Body
older
dense
than
and
the...
all the-
That's right. Yeah. So the body was the oldest bit. So they kept the body. So I mean, I think it's really because how do you keep a body? Everybody. You know, and so this idea of them being wrapped, that we did some research as well that suggested that they'd been eviscerated. So they hadn't rotted.
Oh.
So
They've been dipped in the peat, haven't they?
Because
Sort of
they're-
decomposed.
yeah, so the idea is that
Peatballs, yeah.
yes, that they were preserved in some way. One of the ways they could have been preserved was being by putting in peat, because the bone was slightly etched. And then maybe they were kept and dried or pickled or something and then tightly wrapped. So whether they lost their, you know, you're tempted to think that they lose their hair,
Yeah.
or, I mean, obviously the better story is that there were three important people that they wanted to put together. It's like 3 in 1. So what you're actually doing is perhaps you're combining groups, or you're telling a story, and you know, you're bringing the 3 important ancestors together to make one individual, and you're burying them.
Combining identities.
Yeah.
Or a practical solution that you need to bury your ancestor in the floor for good luck. It's like, oh my god, we've lost a bit, you know.
No, I'm sure that there's, you know, the coming together of 3 great tribes, and each of them, anyway. It is very odd, but they do that.
You've seen the Peruvian
No, Velveeta cake, she is all one piece. She's all one individual. Is there any? No. I mean, Cladh Hallan mummies are really important because it was the first time that anybody had ever identified a composite body. And it was only because it was, the reason why it was identified was because we're looking, we dig in the body thinking, it's what's really being kind of shaped, or, you know,
very tight.
very tight, you know, it's kind of like, it was a bit weird. But also they had no teeth on their lower mandible, but they had dentition on the top. And it's really, really unusual to have fully kind of healed lower mandible and no teeth, and still have teeth. Because what happens is if you don't have opposition to your teeth, they fall out. Yeah. So we were like, well, this mandible doesn't look like it goes with this skull. You know, and it was only then my radio cut, it was like, oh, you know. And so lots of people had seen these sorts of kind of crouch burials for a very long period of time. And people had seen bodies that bits were missing or didn't quite fit, but but lots of these were kind of in antiquarian narratives, you know, with little sketches, because they were awfully, you know, it looks like one of those mummies or something. But nobody had actually put it all together. And it was only because this body looked weird in the mandible that we actually did dating, and we could afford to do dating. You know, we had the techniques, we did DNA, we do all of these things that people wouldn't have been able to do in the past. And so that was like the first time that these composite bodies were identified, and since then people have gone on to identify a few. But the Cladh Hallan one is still the most famous one in the
Really
world.
sounding lots of others that have been in storage.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have your second question?
Yeah, I remember. The young deer that they were killing, did you ever find tools, like are their bones formed enough to make tools with it? Do you think those are reason like for the size of the bone, or?
They don't tend to use immature deer bones. No, they just snack them.
There's just a couple of observations. One that what she was saying about using heritage, right, in terms of craft. Sadly, it hasn't been very well organised, very well advertised. But especially the museum up at Linnecliff is running every Saturday. Well, a lot of Saturdays they've been doing stuff. They're doing one looking at museum artefacts actually tomorrow. Looking at doing some block printing from that.
Oh.
And they've done some glass work, and they've done some other stuff, and there's a creative writing workshop looking at stuff to do with the museum as
Who's
well.
organised that?
Katrina?
Yeah, she's been doing it, but sadly there only seems to have been a sort of notice on the library board, not much on
Well,
social media.
we gave Katrina a full spot, and they got to a full set of other tools. replicas that we left with other people to kind of.
Like the things you have passing around,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
some of them.
So we're going to the school tomorrow, so we're hoping to catch up.
Oh, right. And the other thing, it's quite ironic that tonight you've been talking about the importance of red deer, and I don't know if you're aware that this is and one of the arguments that was put to me was, well, these red deer only came in the 1970s.
That's because a man called John Fletcher, he has a book called Deer, if you want to read it. There's also a bit in the Hebridean Natural History magazine, which I have, because Mary Hall gave it to me years ago. He did bring some deer in 1976, he brought 6 deer. But there's a woman called Josephine Pemberton, so she's like your biggest deer geneticist, and she's based at Edinburgh University, and they've done modern genetic studies of all of the deer across Scotland, and basically the deer here are just the Scottish deer.
So the argument can't be made that
No.
it goes up to something else.
In the late 19th century, and at that time, I understand that the first deer were being brought into North Uras for the hunting, and they were coming from Mar Lodge. And the South Uras deer, because the different boats and different transport, were coming up from Argyll, from Faunal Estates. So they were the earliest deer that were reintroduced in the 19th century. There were deer imports later on in the 1950s. There were the 6 that came in the 70s. There were more brought in the 1990s, and they were put into a large enclosure which is still there at the back of Askervane before they were released into the wild. They were kept there for 6 months. And still at the top of Askervane you find a little caravan at the top of this enclosure, which is where the sort of shepherd used to be living while he's taking care of these animals that are being brought in. So we've had lots of different influxes, but obviously the earliest ones were back in the Neolithic, was where the major part happened. And they would have probably been slum crossed behind dugout canoe or whatever they were using for vessels at that stage.
When is it thought the North Uras ones went extinct? There's several place names like Huntingsea.
Yeah, you see, I don't know very well.
There's 2.
No, I mean, it's really interesting because we've got lots of genetic evidence, but it was never the question that we asked. So I've asked my geneticists to go back and look at the data. Because basically Josephine Pemberton just says they look just like Scottish Island deer. And that's their conclusion, because nobody said, do they look like South Uras Scottish deer, or do they look like... So they look the same as the other deer, they look a bit similar to the Lewis and Harris deer, would you believe? But the problem is that because people became obsessed, not with making bigger deer, but it's the whole family. They bring in those German deer, and they start improving all of the deer in Scotland. So all of the deer in Scotland because there's a point at which I think they thought that the Scottish deer weren't big enough compared to the ones they used to have back home. So they started to import giant big stags to try and improve them. So they've all got slightly, but they're all still pure red deer.
There seems to be some difference in the antlers of the island deer, possibly with the extra calcium from the maca vegetation. So you get heavier antlers, you get more cancella stone on the outside.
I don't know. But then I only look at the island deer.
Did they get the biggest, regularly get the biggest stag?
Yeah.
17
Yeah.
posts, isn't it?
And if you compare them to the antlers that you see in, say, Argyll, where you've got almost no calcium in the natural vegetation of the natural landscape, they have very much smaller, less substantial antlers.
Hard to go, would you believe all this stuff?
40 years, do you know it all?
I know. Well, I always think the story about them eating the legs of the chicks are quite funny, but that's not. On Rum, they kept finding birds with no legs because they thought there was some problem with them. when they realised the deer were going flicking them over and chewing the legs off the chicks because they wanted the calcium. Yeah, sorry. So they will chew old animals because basically, you know, they need the calcium. But I mean, sorry to go on about them, but they are the most amazing species. You know, so as you think about it, they're the only animals, and they're quite often linked to shamanism. If you see those really early pictures, and you get those fantastic red deer headdresses from the early Mesolithic sites, and the idea is that the antler is like aerials to the gods, and that the deer can actually kind of basically they've got antennae that are bringing they're all down. But I think it's more to do with the fact because in sort of shamanistic societies, people are really interested in animals that move between worlds, you know, and so the deer kind of, I guess they're the only animal that grows a part of their body and sheds it and then regrows it, so that's like magic. The other things that they really like are sort of things like seabirds and stuff because they move from the air to the water to the, and again deer actually are quite good at kind of moving between. They will swim out to places. We saw them all over North Unis, the little islands actually. We came in September. They are marauding on the islands. Yeah. So I mean they're important in some societies. Anyway. Any more? Small sheep.
I'd like to just mention one thing.
Sure.
You mentioned about the pottery, 90-odd% of it being milk
Oh yeah.
infused. There is an interesting historical documentation on Lewis where pottery was actually seasoned
That's
with
right.
milk
Yes.
to give it waterproofing
That's right.
qualities.
It's either that or cabbage.
So
You can use plant waxes.
that may be that you use that sort of technique, and of course then you get
Yeah.
100% of your pots would have.
So if you look at that, what you can do is you can look at the boiling profiles. Because what you'll find is the fat will be more concentrated. You know, if you think about if you boil stuff, you get the fat. So what you can do is you can look at the profiles of the pot, and then you can kind of see whether they're actually just painting it on, or whether they're probably cooking with it.
But they still have milk anyway, whatever.
Yeah, whatever they do. I mean, whether you're painting your pot with it, or whether you're making it into cheese.
So I think we'll let you escape now.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating as ever. We hope you'll come back again.
Well, yes, we
I know
shall.
you've
We
got
shall.
some plans
Yes,
to
we're
be back
planning to
later
come back.
in the year.
Mm.
And obviously, hopefully that match will be equally successful to the previous
Yes, and
ones.
I have volunteered to look at the bone from the site.
Oh right, so you're going to be doing the skin and horse hand.
So,
Stand by for a while.
Carries on.
Coming down.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were several hundred.
yeah.
As you noticed. Yeah.
It's alright, so that's not 150,000.
So if you put your hands together.
Yeah.